The October sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Thomas McKinnon's farm, its rays shimmering like ghosts across the withered corn stalks that stood like broken soldiers in his fields. For 3 months, the Oklahoma Territory had seen no rain, and the Irish immigrants' dreams of prosperity seemed to evaporate with each passing day. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, his green eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of clouds. At 32, he had already lived through enough hardship in County Cork to last several lifetimes, but this drought tested even his legendary stubbornness. The small wooden cabin he'd built with his own hands sat like a lonely sentinel against the vast prairie, its chimney cold despite the approaching winter. Another day without rain, he muttered to himself in his thick Irish brogue, kicking at the dusty soil that had once been rich and black. His stomach growled, reminding him that breakfast had been nothing more than weak coffee and a crust of bread, the same meal he'd eaten for the past week. The sound of his neighbor's wagon approaching broke the morning silence. Samuel Rogers, a fellow settler from Tennessee, pulled up beside Thomas's fence line, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, Thomas," Samuel called out, though his tone carried no warmth. "Heard tell the railroad men were sniffing around your property yesterday." Thomas's jaw tightened. Aye, they were, offering me $20 an acre for land that should be worth 3 times that in a good year. "Maybe you should consider it," Samuel said, adjusting his position on the wagon seat. "Word is the government's planning to open up more Cherokee land soon. Lot of folks think it's better to take what you can get now before things get complicated." The mention of the Cherokee made Thomas's stomach churn with unease. His farm sat on the border between settler territory and Cherokee lands, a boundary that had become increasingly tense as more white families moved west. He'd heard the stories, raids, conflicts, families driven from their homes, yet in 2 years of farming here, he'd never had trouble with the Cherokee. In fact, he'd rarely seen them at all. "I'm not selling to those railroad vultures," Thomas said firmly. "This land is all I have. My Mary died believing we'd make something of ourselves here." Samuel's expression softened slightly at the mention of Thomas's late wife. Mary McKinnon had succumbed to fever during their second winter in Oklahoma, leaving Thomas alone with nothing but memories and a determination to honor her faith in their new life. "I understand, Thomas. Truly I do. But a man's got to be practical. Winter's coming, and if this drought doesn't break soon..." Samuel left the sentence hanging like a threat. After Samuel's wagon disappeared down the dirt road, Thomas walked the perimeter of his property, taking inventory of his dwindling resources. The well still had water, though the level dropped daily. His small vegetable garden had yielded barely enough to fill a basket. The corn crop was a total loss. He had perhaps 2 weeks' worth of food remaining, mostly dried beans, a bit of salt pork, and 3 loaves of bread Mary had taught him to bake. As he rounded the corner near the tree line that bordered Cherokee territory, Thomas noticed something unusual. Smoke was rising from beyond the trees, thin wisps that spoke of a small, carefully tended fire. Cherokee, most likely. The thought made him pause. He'd been told to keep his distance, that the Cherokee were dangerous and unpredictable. Yet standing there in the fading afternoon light, watching that distant smoke curl into the cloudless sky, Thomas felt something unexpected. Curiosity rather than fear. That evening, as he sat on his cabin's small porch with a cup of chicory coffee and a slice of bread for dinner, Thomas found himself thinking about the smoke. Someone was out there, probably no more than a mile away, living under the same merciless sky that threatened his own survival. For all the warnings he'd received about the Cherokee, they were fighting the same drought, facing the same uncertain winter. The temperature was already dropping as autumn deepened. Soon, the first frost would come, followed by the harsh Oklahoma winter that had claimed his Mary. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and looked up at the star-filled sky, wondering if tomorrow would finally bring the rain they all desperately needed. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring something far more significant than rain, an encounter that would change not only his own fate, but challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, kindness, and the true meaning of community on the American frontier. Dawn arrived gray and cold, painting the Oklahoma landscape in muted tones of brown and gold. Thomas McKinnon stepped outside his cabin, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as he made his way to the well. The familiar routine of drawing water had become a daily prayer, each bucket a small victory against the drought that threatened to claim his farm. As he walked toward the vegetable garden to check for any salvageable produce, A flash of movement near the edge of his property caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a deer or perhaps a stray dog, but as his eyes adjusted to the morning light, he realized it was something else entirely. A small figure lying motionless beside his fence. Thomas's heart began to race. His neighbor's warnings about Cherokee raiders echoed in his mind, but as he approached cautiously, he saw that the figure was just a child, a boy who couldn't be more than 10 years old. The child's dark hair was matted with dirt, his clothes torn and threadbare. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the sharp angles of ribs beneath the boy's thin shirt. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Thomas whispered, all thoughts of potential danger forgotten. He quickened his pace, dropping to his knees beside the unconscious child. The boy's skin was cold to the touch, his breathing shallow but steady. Cherokee, without question, his features and the beadwork on his small leather pouch made that clear. But all Thomas saw was a child in desperate need of help. "Easy now, lad," Thomas murmured, gently lifting the surprisingly light boy into his arms. "Let's get you warmed up." Inside the cabin, Thomas laid the child on his own bed, covering him with Mary's quilt, the only truly valuable thing he owned. He built up the fire and put on a pot of water, then sat beside the bed, studying the boy's face. There was something peaceful about his features, despite the obvious signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. After an hour, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark as coffee beans and filled with immediate wariness. He tried to sit up quickly, but weakness overcame him, and he fell back against the pillow. "Whoa there, son," Thomas said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. You collapsed near my fence." The boy stared at him, clearly understanding some English but saying nothing. His eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the small cooking area, the rifle hanging above the fireplace. Thomas could see the child calculating, assessing whether this white farmer represented safety or danger. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward his stomach and then to the boy. Recognition flashed in the child's eyes, followed by a barely perceptible nod. Thomas went to his meager pantry and pulled out one of his 3 remaining loaves of bread. It represented nearly 2 days' worth of food for him, but looking at the boy's hollow cheeks, he didn't hesitate. He cut several thick slices, spread them with a bit of precious butter, and poured a cup of milk from his small store. The boy's eyes widened when Thomas placed the food beside him. He sat up slowly, looking between the bread and Thomas's face as if expecting some trick or demand for payment. When Thomas simply nodded encouragingly, the child began to eat with the careful restraint of someone who had learned not to trust abundance. "Take your time, lad," Thomas said softly. "There's no rush." As the boy ate, Thomas found himself thinking of his own childhood in Ireland, of the times when English landlords had taken so much of the crops that his family had gone days without proper meals. Hunger was a language that transcended all cultural boundaries. The boy finished the bread slowly, drinking the milk in small, savoring sips. When he was done, he placed his hands together and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. "What's your name, son?" Thomas asked gently. The boy pointed to himself and said something in Cherokee that sounded like Ayana. Then he pointed to Thomas with a questioning look. "Thomas," the farmer replied, placing his hand on his chest. "Thomas McKinnon." Ayana repeated the name carefully, his pronunciation giving it a musical quality that made Thomas smile for the first time in weeks. For the next several hours, the boy rested while Thomas went about his daily chores. When he returned, he found Ayana sitting up, looking much stronger. The child had folded Mary's quilt neatly and was examining the simple wooden cross that hung on the wall, one of the few possessions Thomas had brought from Ireland. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas shared another meal with the boy, beans and a bit of salt pork that he cooked into a simple stew. Ayana ate more eagerly now, and even managed what might have been the beginning of a smile when Thomas made exaggerated faces while trying to communicate without words. When evening approached, the boy stood and walked to the door, clearly intending to leave. Thomas felt a pang of worry. The night would be cold, and despite the food, Ayana still looked far too thin to survive on his own. "You can stay," Thomas said, gesturing to the bed. "It's going to be a cold night." But Ayana shook his head firmly. He approached Thomas and placed his small hand on the farmer's arm, looking up into his eyes with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. Then he touched his own chest and pointed toward the forest, communicating clearly that he needed to return to his people. Thomas nodded, understanding. He wrapped the remaining half-loaf of bread in a cloth and handed it to the boy, along with his spare jacket, a coat that had belonged to Mary but would serve to keep the child warm. At the door, Ayanna turned back one final time. He spoke a phrase in Cherokee, his tone formal and serious, then disappeared into the gathering dusk like a shadow. Thomas stood in his doorway long after the boy had vanished, wondering if he would ever see the child again. The cabin felt emptier now, and he realized that for a few hours he had forgotten about his failing crops, his dwindling food supplies, and his uncertain future. Instead, he had simply been a man helping another human being, perhaps the most important thing he had done since Mary's death. As he prepared for bed, Thomas had no way of knowing that Ayanna's formal words had been a promise. "I will remember your kindness, and my father will know of it." Thomas awakened before dawn to a sound that made his blood run cold, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats surrounding his cabin, not the gentle clip-clop of a neighbor's horse, but the coordinated movement of many riders approaching with military precision. He lay still for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to count the horses. 20? 50? More? Slipping quietly from his bed, Thomas crept to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Warriors on horseback formed a perfect circle around his property, their silhouettes dark against the pale morning sky. Even in the dim light, he could see they were Cherokee, proud, mounted figures with painted faces and traditional weapons, sitting their horses with the stillness of men accustomed to warfare. "Mother of God," Thomas whispered, his Irish accent thick with fear. His mind raced through possibilities. Had someone seen him helping Ayanna? Was this retribution for some boundary he'd unknowingly crossed? His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle above the fireplace, but he stopped himself. What good would one gun do against what appeared to be hundreds of warriors? As the sun crested the horizon, Thomas could see the full scope of what surrounded him. The circle of warriors stretched beyond his property line in every direction. Not 20 or 50, but easily 300 men. They sat motionless, neither threatening nor retreating, simply present with an authority that spoke of absolute control. A single rider separated from the group and approached the cabin. This warrior was different from the others, older, with silver threading through his black hair, wearing a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers, and carrying himself with unmistakable leadership. His horse, a powerful paint stallion, stepped with the confidence of an animal accustomed to carrying greatness. The man dismounted 20 feet from Thomas's door and stood waiting. Thomas's mouth went dry. Every story he'd heard about Cherokee raids and settler families who had simply disappeared came flooding back. Yet something in the warrior's posture didn't suggest immediate violence. There was formality here, ceremony even. With trembling hands, Thomas opened his door and stepped onto his small porch. The Cherokee leader studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the Irish farmer's appearance. Thomas was acutely aware of his own shabby clothing, his calloused hands, the obvious signs of his poverty and struggle. Yet he forced himself to stand straight, meeting the warrior's gaze with what dignity he could muster. "You are Thomas McKinnon," the man said in clear, accented English that surprised Thomas with its fluency. "Aye, that I am," Thomas replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "And you are?" "I am Atsila Sagonige, Standing Bear to your people, war chief of the Cherokee Nation." The man's voice carried the weight of mountains, deep and resonant. "Yesterday, my son came home." Thomas felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. Ayanna, the boy he'd fed and sheltered, was the son of a Cherokee war chief. His knees nearly buckled as he realized the implications. "Ayanna told me of your kindness," Standing Bear continued, taking a step closer. "He spoke of how you found him collapsed from hunger, how you brought him into your home, fed him your own food, and sent him away with bread and a coat." The chief's eyes never left Thomas's face. "He told me you asked for nothing in return." Thomas swallowed hard. The lad was starving. Any decent man would have done the same. A ghost of a smile appeared at the corner of Standing Bear's mouth. "Perhaps. But you are not any man, Thomas McKinnon. You are a man who lives alone on the edge of our lands, who has lost his woman to the fever, who struggles to survive the same drought that threatens my people. Yet when you found a Cherokee child, a child whose people your neighbors fear and mistrust, you gave him your food." The war chief walked closer, close enough that Thomas could see the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt, the scars that marked his hands and arms, evidence of a life spent in battle and hardship. "My son could have died yesterday," Standing Bear said quietly. "He had been lost for 3 days, separated from our hunting party during a storm. When he did not return, I gathered my warriors to search. We were prepared to find his body." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I'm glad he made it home safe. Because of you, he did." Standing Bear's voice carried a weight of emotion that seemed to surprise even him. "In our tradition, a life debt must be honored. You saved my son, Thomas McKinnon. Now I must ask, what would you have of me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas looked beyond Standing Bear at the circle of warriors, still motionless on their horses, then back at the chief's weathered face. The wrong answer here could mean death, not just for him, but potentially for other settlers in the area. The right answer might mean survival. "I want nothing," Thomas said finally. "I helped the boy because it was right, not because I expected payment." Standing Bear studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "This is what Ayana told me you would say. He said you have the eyes of a man who understands hunger, who gives without counting the cost." The chief paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "But I cannot let a life debt go unpaid. It would dishonor both our peoples." Thomas watched as Standing Bear walked back toward his horse, wondering if this was where the conversation would end. Instead, the chief reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something that gleamed in the morning sunlight, an intricately carved silver medallion on a leather cord. "This belonged to my father, and his father before him," Standing Bear said, returning to Thomas. "It bears the mark of our clan and the protection of our ancestors. As long as you wear this, no Cherokee warrior will raise his hand against you or yours." Thomas stared at the medallion, understanding instinctively that he was being offered something far more valuable than silver. I cannot accept such a gift." "It is not a gift," Standing Bear replied firmly. "It is payment of a debt. To refuse would be to dishonor my son's life and my word as a chief." With ceremony that felt ancient and profound, Standing Bear placed the cord around Thomas's neck. The medallion was warm against his chest, surprisingly heavy for its size. "But this is not all," the chief continued, and Thomas felt his stomach drop. "The debt is too great for one token to satisfy." Standing Bear stepped back and raised his hand toward the circle of warriors. Immediately, the sound of movement filled the air as dozens of Cherokee men dismounted and began walking toward Thomas's property. Panic shot through the Irish farmer's chest. Had the medallion been some sort of trick? But instead of weapons, the warriors carried tools, hoes, shovels, buckets, and other implements that Thomas couldn't immediately identify. They moved with purpose but without aggression, spreading out across his drought-stricken farm with the efficiency of men who knew exactly what they were doing. "What's happening?" Thomas asked, bewildered. "My warriors have been watching your farm for many days," Standing Bear replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "We know of your struggles with the drought, of your failing crops, of the railroad men who circle like vultures, waiting for you to surrender your land." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed that his poverty was so obvious even to strangers. Well, it's been a difficult season." "For all of us," Standing Bear agreed. "The drought affects Cherokee and white settler alike. The difference is that we know this land, its moods, its secrets, its hidden sources of water." As if to demonstrate his point, several warriors had gathered near the far corner of Thomas's property with strange, forked wooden rods. They walked slowly across the barren ground, holding the rods in front of them with intense concentration. "Water witching," Thomas breathed, recognizing the ancient practice despite never having seen it performed. "We call it listening to the earth's voice," Standing Bear corrected. "Your Irish ancestors knew similar ways, I think. Knowledge that your new country has forgotten in its hurry to tame the wilderness." One of the warriors suddenly stopped, his divining rod dipping sharply toward the ground. He called out in Cherokee, and immediately several other men converged on the spot with digging tools. "But I don't understand," Thomas said, watching the organized activity with growing amazement. "Why would you help me? I'm just one farmer, and from what I hear, your people have enough troubles with the government without—" "That," Standing Bear interrupted, "is exactly why we help you." The chief gestured for Thomas to walk with him toward the area where the warriors were now digging. As they moved across the property, Standing Bear began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "The railroad companies want your land, Thomas McKinnon, not for farming, but because it sits on the route they plan for their new line through Cherokee territory. If you sell to them, they will use your property as a staging area to pressure my people into giving up more of our homeland. Thomas felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. So by helping me keep my farm, we help ourselves, Standing Bear finished. A Cherokee-friendly farmer on this land serves our interests better than a railroad camp. They reached the digging site, where the warriors had already excavated a hole nearly 4 feet deep. The sound of metal striking something hard rang out, followed by excited voices speaking in Cherokee. "Rock!" one of the warriors called out in English, looking disappointed. But Standing Bear smiled and spoke rapidly in Cherokee. The man nodded and began digging again, this time at an angle. Within minutes, the sound of metal on stone changed to the splash of water. "Underground spring," Standing Bear explained to Thomas's amazed expression. "The rock formations here create hidden channels that carry water even during drought. Your well was dug in the wrong place." Thomas watched, speechless, as clear, cold water began filling the bottom of the hole. It was more water than he'd seen in months, bubbling up from some hidden source deep in the earth. "This is impossible," he whispered. "I've been living here 2 years. How did I never know?" "Because you're thinking like a farmer from Green Island, not like a man who understands Oklahoma earth," Standing Bear replied without mockery. "This land has different rules, different gifts. We can teach you those rules." As the morning progressed, Thomas watched 300 Cherokee warriors transform his failing farm with efficiency that bordered on miraculous. New irrigation channels appeared, connecting the spring to his fields. Withered corn stalks were cleared, and the soil prepared for winter wheat. His vegetable garden was expanded and replanted with crops that could survive the harsh Oklahoma climate. But it was more than just physical labor. The warriors worked with a knowledge of the land that Thomas was beginning to realize went far beyond anything he'd learned in Ireland or from his fellow settlers. They knew which plants would grow in drought conditions, how to read the subtle signs that indicated where water might be found, which areas would be protected from winter winds. "Your neighbors will ask questions," Standing Bear said as they watched his men work. "They will want to know why the Cherokee help you instead of driving you away." Thomas nodded, already imagining Samuel Rogers' reaction when he learned about this. "What should I tell them?" "The truth. That kindness to a Cherokee child has earned you the friendship of the Cherokee people." Standing Bear's expression grew more serious. "But understand, Thomas McKinnon, this friendship comes with obligations. We are not simply giving you charity." "What kind of obligations?" Standing Bear was quiet for a moment, watching his warriors redirect a small stream of water from the new spring into the irrigation channels they dug. "Winter is coming, and it will be hard for everyone. The government has reduced our rations again, claiming budget concerns while railroad companies receive millions in subsidies. Many of our children will go hungry." The implication hung in the air between them. Thomas looked around at the miraculous transformation of his farm, at the water flowing where there had been only dust hours before, at the promise of crops that might actually survive the coming season. "You want me to share what I harvest," he said. "When you can, if you can." Standing Bear's voice carried no threat, only quiet hope. "We ask no more than what we give, but we hope for the friendship that grows between neighbors who help each other survive." Thomas thought of young Ayanna, of the hollow look in the boy's eyes when he'd found him collapsed from hunger. He thought of his own childhood in Ireland, of British landlords who took so much that Irish children starved while their grain fed English horses. "Aye," he said quietly, "that seems fair." Standing Bear extended his hand in the white man's custom, and Thomas shook it firmly. But as their hands clasped, the Cherokee chief spoke words in his own language, words that sounded like a blessing or perhaps a binding. "What did you say?" Thomas asked. "I said, may this friendship be strong enough to survive the storms that are coming." Standing Bear's eyes were troubled as he looked toward the horizon. "Because storms are coming, Thomas McKinnon. For all of us." 3 weeks after the Cherokee warriors had transformed his farm, Thomas McKinnon stood in his fields, watching the most abundant harvest he'd ever seen in Oklahoma. The winter wheat had taken root with surprising vigor. His expanded vegetable garden overflowed with late-season crops, and the spring that Standing Bear's men had found continued to flow with clear, cold water, even as neighboring farms went dry. But the miracle of his prosperity had not gone unnoticed. "You've got some explaining to do, McKinnon," Samuel Rogers called out as he approached Thomas's fence line, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Behind him rode 3 other men Thomas recognized from town: Bill Henderson, who owned the general store, Marcus Webb from the bank, and a stranger in an expensive suit who could only be one thing: railroad company. Thomas wiped his hands on his work pants and walked toward the fence, noting how the men's horses shied nervously, as if sensing tension in the air. The silver medallion, standing bare, had given him felt warm against his chest beneath his shirt. "Morning, Samuel," Thomas replied evenly. "What brings you out my way?" "Don't play dumb with us," Bill Henderson snapped, his weathered face flushed with anger. "The whole territory's talking about what happened here. 300 Cherokee warriors camped on your property for a full day, and somehow you're the only farmer in 50 miles whose crops aren't failing." The stranger in the suit urged his horse forward, studying Thomas with cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. McKinnon, I'm James Morrison, representing the Oklahoma and Western Railroad Company. We've heard some very disturbing reports about your associations." Thomas felt his Irish temper beginning to rise, but forced himself to remain calm. "I don't know what you mean by associations, Mr. Morrison. I'm just a farmer trying to make a living." "A farmer who's made some very dangerous friends," Marcus Webb interjected. "Thomas, people are scared. The Cherokee haven't moved in such large numbers for years. Folks are worried about raids, about their families' safety." "The Cherokee helped me find water and replant my fields," Thomas said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. "Nothing more? Mr. McKinnon, you've been seen wearing Cherokee jewelry, sharing meals with their war chiefs, and according to several witnesses, you've been observed teaching Cherokee children to read English." That last accusation made Thomas's stomach clench. It was true. Over the past weeks, Ayanna had returned several times, often bringing other children from his village. Thomas had shared food with them and, yes, had begun teaching some of them basic English words. It had seemed natural, neighborly even. Now he realized how such actions might be interpreted by fearful settlers. "Teaching children to read is hardly a crime," Thomas said carefully. "It is when those children are being prepared to spy on white settlements," Samuel replied angrily. "Thomas, don't you see what's happening? They're using you. All this help with your farm, it's not charity, it's positioning. They want a foothold in settler territory." Morrison pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag and held it up like a weapon. "Mr. McKinnon, I have here a formal complaint signed by 12 of your neighbors, requesting territorial investigation into your activities. The government takes the security of its citizens very seriously, especially when it comes to unauthorized cooperation with hostile indigenous populations." Hostile? Thomas felt his control slipping. "The Cherokee have done nothing but help me survive a drought that would have killed my crops." "How is that hostile?" "Because they're Cherokee," Bill Henderson said flatly. "That's all the hostility any sane man needs to worry about." The prejudice in Henderson's voice made Thomas think of his own experiences in Ireland, of English landlords who had spoken about Irish farmers with the same dismissive contempt. The parallel made him sick. "They're people," Thomas said quietly. "Same as us. They hunger, they worry about their children, they struggle to survive." Morrison's expression turned predatory. "Mr. McKinnon, let me be very clear about your situation. The railroad company has been authorized by the territorial government to acquire land for our expansion through this region. We've made you a generous offer for your property, an offer that still stands. But if you continue to harbor Cherokee sympathies, if you persist in providing them aid and comfort, that offer will be withdrawn and other measures will be considered." "What kind of other measures?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The kind that might result in your farming license being revoked for security reasons," Marcus Webb said apologetically. "Thomas, I've known you since you arrived here. I helped you get the loan for this land, but the bank has to consider the concerns of our other customers. If people believe you're a threat to community safety—" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Thomas looked at each man in turn, seeing fear in Samuel's eyes, greed in Morrison's, and reluctant compliance in Webb and Henderson. These were his neighbors, men he'd shared meals with, worked alongside during barn raisings and harvest times. Now they stood against him because he had shown kindness to a hungry child. "I need time to think," Thomas said finally. "You have 3 days," Morrison replied, rolling up his document. "After that, the railroad's offer expires, and I suspect you'll find life in this territory becoming increasingly difficult. As the four men rode away, Thomas stood alone in his thriving fields, watching their horses kick up dust clouds in the distance. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time since arriving in Oklahoma, his farm was successful, his future secure, and now he was being forced to choose between that success and the friendship that had made it possible. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Thomas wasn't surprised to see a familiar figure approaching through the trees. Standing Bear emerged from the forest alone, walking with the quiet dignity Thomas had come to associate with the Cherokee leader. "You have visitors today," the chief observed, settling onto a fallen log near Thomas's porch. "News travels fast," Thomas replied, joining him with 2 cups of coffee. "In times of trouble, news travels on the wind itself." Standing Bear accepted the coffee gratefully. "My scouts tell me railroad men came with your neighbors. They spoke of fear, of threats." Thomas nodded, staring into his cup as if it might contain answers. "They want me to cut ties with your people, stop the friendship, stop the teaching, stop the sharing of food. And if you refuse, they'll destroy me, take my land, revoke my licenses, probably run me out of the territory entirely." Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated sorrows. "This is not the first time friendship between our peoples has been tested by fear and greed," he said, "nor will it be the last. The question is, what kind of man do you choose to be when the test comes?" Thomas thought of Ayanna, of the trust in the boy's eyes when he had first accepted food from a stranger. He thought of the other Cherokee children who had begun visiting his farm, eager to learn new words, to share stories, to bridge the gap between their worlds. He thought of his late wife Mary, who had always insisted that kindness was the only true measure of a person's worth. "If I stand with you, they'll destroy everything we've built here," Thomas said quietly. "All the work your warriors did, all the progress we've made, it'll be for nothing." "Perhaps," Standing Bear agreed. "Or perhaps it will be the beginning of something larger than either of us can imagine." The Cherokee chief stood and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I will not ask you to sacrifice yourself for my people, Thomas McKinnon. The choice must be yours alone. But know this, whatever you decide, the friendship you showed my son will be remembered. Some bonds cannot be broken by fear or threats." As Standing Bear melted back into the darkness, Thomas remained on his porch, wrestling with the most important decision of his life. Around him, his rescued farm hummed with life, water flowing through irrigation channels, crops rustling in the evening breeze, the promise of prosperity that had seemed impossible just weeks before. But prosperity built on the abandonment of principle was no prosperity at all. As the night deepened and the weight of his choice pressed down upon him, Thomas McKinnon began to understand what kind of man he truly was, and what that meant for the storm that was coming. In the distance, barely audible on the night wind, came the sound of Cherokee drums, carrying messages between villages, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. Thomas listened to their rhythm and felt something settle in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a deep well. His decision was made.